All down through human history, the creation around us has forced people to acknowledge the existence of God, our Creator. People planted seed in the ground and saw it grow into crops for food, and they thanked God for making that happen. People raised animals for wool, for milk, and for meat, and they thanked God for those provisions. And as they worked their farms or hunted in the fields and forests, people observed the birds flying overhead and all the living creatures running around, and they acknowledged the Creator. Paul wrote in his letter to the Romans, "What may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from his workmanship, so that men are without excuse." But in modern times, men have come up with an excuse for not believing in God, and that excuse is the theory of evolution. But it's a flimsy excuse because godless evolution is a lie. It can be proved false by looking closely at the creation around us. The Bible adds to the testimony of creation around us by telling us plainly that the one true God created heaven and earth and everything around us, and that he even made us from the dust of the ground. Genesis says, "The Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed the breath of life into his nostrils, and the man became a living being." Just as God made man from the dust of the ground, he created the animals and birds in the same way. Genesis also says, "Out of the ground the Lord formed every beast of the field and every bird of the air, and he brought them to the man to see what he would name each one. And whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name. The man gave names to all the livestock, to the birds of the air, and to every beast of the field." To say that God formed the birds, animals, and humans from the dust of the ground may sound simplistic, but those were actually profound scientific statements. They were profound scientific statements well beyond the knowledge of the nomadic sheep herders who wrote down the scriptures under divine inspiration. It was only in modern times that scientific study revealed that the flesh of men and animals is made up of the same chemical elements as the soil, the dust of the ground. About 99% of the human body is made up of 6 elements: oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus. The remaining 1% is mainly composed of another 5 elements: potassium, sulfur, sodium, chlorine, and magnesium, along with trace amounts of other elements. And those are the very same elements found in the soil, the dust of the ground. Scientific analysis provided a powerful confirmation of the Bible's simple statement that God made us and the animals from the soil, from the dust of the ground. But around the time that this scientific discovery was found to confirm the Bible account, Satan the devil was laying the groundwork for undermining belief in God. 2 major elements of the devil's scheme were urbanization and the theory of evolution. Industrialization began moving much of the population from farms to factories based in cities. The effect of urbanization on belief in God was subtle but profound. Throughout most of human history, the vast majority lived close to nature, farming the land or hunting in the fields and forests, where they saw God's handiwork all around them, forcing them to acknowledge the Creator. Modern industrialization moved huge populations from farms to cities, surrounding them with walls and man-made objects instead of God's natural creation. With God's workmanship and creation removed from their sight, city dwellers now lost sight of the evidence revealing the Creator. The result is what we see today: sophisticated city dwellers scoffing at religious country folk. It even shows up in music, in the contrast between the secular music of the cities and the religious content of country music. People who grow up around horses, cattle, sheep, and hogs, catching their own fish and watching birds in the fields and forests, these people are more likely to see God in their lives than people who grow up surrounded by buildings, where wildlife intrudes on their bodies, on their lives, only in the form of mice and rats and cockroaches. So part of Satan's plan to turn people away from God unfolded in modern times as populations shifted from the countryside to the large towns and cities. Satan the devil's second scheme, implemented around the same time as moving people into cities, was introducing the theory of evolution. The theory of evolution gave people an excuse for not believing in God. They could now claim that the animals and birds, and even we ourselves, came into existence without being formed from the dust of the ground by our Creator. In 1859, Charles Darwin published his book, The Origin of Species. Darwin's book introduced the theory of evolution, the theory that completely new species arose from small variations over millions of years. He assumed that a series of small variations over time could add up to very large variations, resulting in a totally new animal. Evolution theory claims that totally new forms of life arise when accidents over millions of years combine to produce a new species that didn't exist before. The theory of evolution is that man evolved from an ape-like animal, that birds evolved from fish, and so on. For example, if a particular type of fish escaped being eaten by predators by jumping out of the water, and if that fish were able to jump higher and stay out of the water longer, it was more likely to survive. Darwin's theory would conclude that many generations of that selection process would eventually result in the fish developing wings, becoming birds instead of fish, through many years of survival by the fish that could stay aloft the longest. But there was a critical piece of information that Charles Darwin was missing. He was missing the fact that fins and wings that might look fairly similar to the naked eye actually differed from each other by millions of lines of DNA code. The written instructions in the fish eggs and in the bird eggs that told the cells how to grow into fins or wings. Back then in the mid-1800s, when Darwin wrote his book, he and his fellow scientists could not see anything smaller than the cell. They couldn't see what went on inside cells, and they assumed that the cell was a simple building block for living things. They didn't know anything about the complex genetic code, the DNA found in each cell's nucleus. They did not know that the difference between fish and birds was vastly more complicated than a series of small structural differences. It might look like a small thing for a jumping fish's fin to evolve into a bird's wing, but that's because Darwin and his friends couldn't see the microscopic DNA code. They didn't realize that millions of lines of code were involved. Darwin and his supporters in the late 1800s and early 1900s saw small variations among individual creatures, and they assumed that a series of small changes over a long period of time could end up changing a fish into a horse and a monkey into a man. What they didn't count on was that the differences between species were not small at all when you looked at the genetic code. The instructions in the DNA for a monkey could not be changed into the DNA for a man without rewriting millions of lines of code. You could breed animals into Guernsey milk cows or Angus beef cattle because the code for all the different breeds was already present in the DNA. Breeding just caused one part of the existing DNA to go into action instead of another part of the same DNA. No new code was involved in the breeding process. No new code was written. You could breed dogs into Chihuahuas or Great Danes because dog DNA already contained the code for each one of those varieties. It was already written in the dog DNA how to produce all the breeds of dogs, and breeding simply activated one part or another of that already existing DNA. But to breed a dog into a cat, that would be impossible. Cat DNA is not present in dogs, and dog DNA is not present in cats. The existing DNA would have to be rewritten by a knowledgeable and skillful coder who could write the DNA code. That's what it would take to change one species into another. Complex code rewriting, not just some small accidental changes. Changing the fertilized egg that produces a dog into a fertilized egg that would grow into a cat would be like pulling volumes out of an encyclopedia and substituting other volumes full of entirely different articles. Scientists today have learned how to manipulate DNA by cutting out working segments and pasting those pieces elsewhere, but they lack the ability to write volumes of new DNA code. In order for the evolution theory to be true, instead of accidental changes to a few letters in the DNA code, whole new volumes of DNA code would have to be written completely by accident. From Darwin's time onward, supporters of evolution pointed to what they called random mutation and survival of the fittest. Those were the keys to their evolution theory: random mutation and survival of the fittest. But random mutations don't write volumes of new code. Random mutations break code. Small accidental changes to the DNA code result in code that doesn't work at all because it's broken. Random mutations changing a few letters in the DNA results only in broken DNA. In order for new DNA to work, many, many lines of perfectly written code would have to come into existence together at the same time. But Darwin was missing that information because the DNA had not yet been discovered in his lifetime. The discovery of the DNA blueprint with coded instructions for building living things should have convinced everyone to believe in the Creator, God. But by the time this new information came to light in recent decades, the scientific community had already drummed out of their profession nearly everyone who believed in creation. They covered up the fact that new evidence proved Darwin's evolution theory to be false. But it could now be plainly seen that the differences between species of animals did not result from small accidental changes. Animals differ from one another due to brilliantly written genetic code that was written by the Almighty Creator. The discovery that the genetic code is a blueprint written in DNA code shows that each living species was designed by God. But there was hardly anyone left in the scientific profession to give God the glory for this amazing discovery. We've seen that random mutations, that element of evolution theory, is really bogus, but so is the other component, which they call survival of the fittest. For example, evolutionists tell us that birds evolved camouflage. They evolved camouflage because it helped them to survive, they say. And they point to birds like this one in the picture here. You have to look carefully to see it, because God gave it feathers that act as camouflage, really good camouflage, making it almost invisible. This article explains how the evolutionists look at it. Its heading says adaptations and strategies used by birds to protect themselves. And it says camouflage, blending in for survival. And it goes on to say many bird species have evolved colors and patterns on their feathers that help them blend in seamlessly with their surroundings. And then the evolutionists claim that this evolution of camouflage enabled the camouflage birds to survive, while the birds that weren't camouflaged died off. And that selection process produced new species of camouflage birds. But this bright red cardinal shows that their argument is completely false. If camouflage led to survival of the fittest, as the evolutionists claim, then this cardinal would have died out ages ago. Its bright red color is just the opposite of camouflage. It's like a red flag saying, "Here I am." Yet the cardinal has survived right alongside the camouflage bird. Clearly, they just represent two different designs that God used in coloring his creation. Now consider that there are millions of different species on Earth. Each one is differentiated from the others by millions upon millions of lines of DNA code. Even if someone could believe that one of them had all of its millions of lines of DNA code written by accident, how could that happen over and over again for each one of the millions of species? But even if a series of accidents over millions of years could write the genetic code for a single species, the existence of so many different creatures still makes it impossible for that many accidents to happen. And this is the missing piece that Darwin didn't know, and that proves his evolution theory to be totally wrong. Accidental evolution of all these creatures is really impossible. We can again stand in awe of the Creator, who wrote that code differently for each one of the millions of species on the planet. Once again, we can say, as Paul wrote to the Romans, "Since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from his workmanship, so that men are without excuse." Those who try to use the evolution theory as an excuse not to believe in God are really without excuse, because that evolution theory is obviously false. God's workmanship in writing the genetic code of millions upon millions of creatures proves his existence as the Almighty Creator.